Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 585. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you on the show today. We have quite a bit to talk about. I got some stories on Lebanon, Yemen, Chad, and you got some news on Israel and how particularly it's impacting the protest movement in America, which is extremely important. So we're going to get into the news very quickly today. We just want to remind people to share the show, support the show how you can. You could subscribe, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee if you want the video version. It's up anywhere you could listen to podcasts. Of course, it's hosted through the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. Follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. Connor, let's get into it. So last week on the show, I updated the situation in Lebanon. Israel had claimed that they were doing quite a bit of destruction to the Lebanese forces. Hezbollah is dismissing the Israeli claims that half of their commanders have been killed. This from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Hezbollah sources commented in the media yesterday on yesterday's claims from the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant that half of the commanders in Hezbollah have been killed and the other half are in hiding and have abandoned the field. The group maintains the claims are untrue and baseless. Gallant's comments garnered a lot of publicity yesterday, although there were questions about its validity as few specifics were provided. Israel often makes claims about commanders killed without offering details as to what punitive commander's actual role was. Hezbollah sources say that only a handful of commanders at meaningful levels have been killed, and that number does not exceed the number of fingers on one hand. Estimates from Israel puts the number of brigade commanders killed at 6, although that figure remains uncertain. The Hezbollah sources speculated that the main purpose of Israeli Defense Ministry claims was to raise Israeli army morale by giving the appearance of progress following many attacks in the south. Elsewhere, Israel continued attacks today in eastern Lebanon, hitting a fuel truck in the area of Durin, just south of Baalbek, damaging a truck and wounding the driver. Israel did not comment on why the fuel truck was targeted. Most Israeli attacks, as usual, continued to target southern Lebanon, with many army reporting strikes in several Lebanese towns. Lebanese towns. And so, Connor, this is just what's going on here, where we're having this constant buildup. And it does seem to be a little bit more intense over the past week than it has been. And we will see what happens. Of course, there are ceasefire negotiations going on. Well, I'm not particularly optimistic about those. If something did materialize, it would likely not only stop the war between Israel and Hamas, which is a slaughter in Gaza, but also the war Israel is fighting with Lebanon and Hezbollah, and also the Houthi interference of Red Sea shipping. And so this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, April 25th. Yemen's Houthis target 2 ships in the Gulf of Aden, and this happened on Wednesday and Thursday as a part of their campaigns to protest the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in the Gaza Sea. The attacks came after a relative lull in Houthi operations following months of frequent attacks. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, claimed they hit the Mazarak Town, a U.S. flagged and owned and operated container ship that has an American crew. However, CENTCOM said the Houthi missile was intercepted that appeared to be targeting the ship. CENTCOM said a coalition vessel successfully engaged one anti-ship ballistic missile that was fired from Houthi-controlled Yemen. CENTCOM also said its forces downed 4 drones over Yemen on Wednesday. The following day, the Houthis claimed another attack on the MSC Darwin, a Liberian-flagged container ship. The British military UK Maritime Trade Operations Center also reported the attack and said the vessel and all crew are safe. On Thursday, the Houthi leader, al-Houthi, said that Ansar Allah's forces would expand attacks on Israeli shipping into the Indian Ocean, and this threat has been made before, so Connor, it's unclear to me if the Houthis actually have this capability, if they actually plan to do it. There was one attack on an Israeli-linked ship that was pretty far into the Indian Ocean, I think maybe thousands of miles from Yemen, so I don't know if that was Yemeni or another form of attack, but this has been happening, as well as Houthis downing American drones. This again, Dave DeCamp, April 28th, antiwar.com. Houthis down U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone for third time since November. A military spokesperson for Yemen's Houthis announced on Saturday that their forces downed a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone that was operating over Yemen and was carrying out a hostile mission. U.S. officials confirmed to CBS News that a U.S. Air Force MQ-9 drone crashed in Yemen early Friday morning and said they are investigating the cause. MQ-9s are estimated to cost $30 million each, and Friday's incident marks the third time the Houthis downed a drone since November. Besides losing $90 million in MQ-9 drones, the U.S. has also used about $1 billion in munitions in its bombing campaign in Yemen and other operations in the Middle East that started due to Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And Connor, I wouldn't be surprised if that number's a lot higher when you consider all the air defense systems they've had to employ as well. All right, the last story I have today, U.S. to temporarily withdraw special force troops from Chad. And this is an update to what me and Dave DeCamp discussed on the show last week. The U.S. will withdraw 75 U.S. Army Special Forces personnel from Chad in the coming day, the New York Times reported on Thursday, citing U.S. officials. The Pentagon later said the move was temporary, as the U.S. was looking to sign a new deal to continue its military presence in the country. The news comes after Chad's government sent a letter to the U.S. threatening to scrap an agreement that justifies the U.S. military personnel in the country. U.S. officials said they are hoping to resume talks on military cooperation after Chad's elections on May 6th. And Connor, I would be very concerned if I were sitting in Chad or Nigeria right now in the presidential palace and you're asking the American forces to leave. My guess is the State Department will do everything they can up to and including carrying out a coup. And of course, the Pentagon and the rest of the U.S. government will help to be able to stay in these countries that they see as really crucial outposts even in the U.S. empire, even if most Americans didn't know that and would maybe even think it's a joke if you claim that either of those countries are actually countries, much less being able to locate those countries on the map. All right, Connor, I'll hand it over to you. I know you got some important stuff, including this great article that you wrote for the Libertarian Institute at the end of last week. Ben-Gvir wants Israeli police to create local response team to protect Jews outside of Israel, and I'm guessing that means in the U.S. So what's this lunatic saying?
Yeah, so Itmar Ben-Gvir, who's, of course, the extremist settler, the national security minister of Israel, who's, he's an extremist settler who lives in the West Bank, very openly supportive of the apartheid system, particularly in the West Bank, talking about how Jews have rights that what essentially, the way they view it is this, that the subhuman Palestinians don't. He's endorsed, attacks on Christians as well, spitting on Christians, which he says is a national pastime or a Jewish tradition. So this is, a very radical Zionist who we've heard a lot from, big supporter of the ethnic cleansing in Gaza and wants to resettle the Strip after the Palestinians, or the ones that are still alive, are pushed out of the Strip. He's now saying that we need to have these, or that the Israeli police need to create these response teams all over the world to protect Jews. And he's accusing, virtually, just like Netanyahu is actually, of all the, and Biden, of all these protesters who are largely Jewish. Of course, the backbone of anti-Zionist activism in the West is typically led by Jews. And so, of course, that this is all propaganda, but it's pretty alarming what they're talking about, and it does sound like something that, especially when we see the brutal crackdown on protesters and how it's supported by virtually all of the political establishment, that this kind of thing could go forward. So I write here that Israel's National Security Minister Itmar Ben-Gvir has called on the police commissioner to create local response teams globally to protect Jewish communities overseas. And this comes amid a wave of anti-war protests on college campuses across the United States, denouncing Washington's support for the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and calling on their universities to divest from companies connected with the Israeli war machine. And I just note again that the rallies are largely led and organized by anti-Zionist Jews, and particularly groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. So he says diaspora Jews are currently suffering from a harsh wave of anti-Semitism in communities and on campuses in the U.S., Europe, and around the world. And this is last Wednesday, according to a report by the Israeli media network Arutz Sheva. He continued, I asked the police commissioner to draft a plan to aid in the creation of local response teams that will protect Jewish communities and institutions overseas through professional tutelage, including a training program and technological solutions for security. It's not clear what such security teams would look like, but Ben-Gvir clarified that these activities would be carried out, quote, in cooperation with the local police and relevant authorities. Now, training programs and tactic exchanges between Israel's notorious occupation forces and American police, spies, and federal agents has already been ongoing for decades, focusing on deploying authoritarian violence and control, including mass surveillance, racial profiling, and the suppression of protests and dissent. As Amnesty International has previously reported, these trainings put U.S. law enforcement employees in the hands of military, security, and police systems that have racked up documented human rights violations for years. Amnesty International, other human rights organizations, and even the U.S. State Department have cited Israeli police for carrying out extrajudicial executions and other unlawful killings, using ill treatment and torture, including against children, suppression of freedom of expression and association, including through government surveillance, and the excessive use of force against peaceful protesters. And so, of course, more than 100 Columbia University students were arrested after the school's administrator, Nimat Minouche, called on the New York Police Department to break up the Gaza Solidarity encampment across the country, including at Berkeley, Harvard, Texas University, and Austin, USC, and UCLA. Similar protest camps have been established and subsequently attacked by police. Actually, I shouldn't say at UCLA. It's not clear to me. The police, it sounds like, and we'll get to this in the next story, are not really intervening even when violence breaks out. Now, a plethora of videos on social media show law enforcement officers violently suppressing the protests, along with assaulting or arresting journalists, as well as university employees supporting the divestment campaigns. Both President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu together have killed at least 34,000 Palestinians in Gaza, including more than 20,000 women and children, have declared these American college student demonstrations anti-Semitic and insisted that they would not let them stand. In fact, Netanyahu said that these protesters are willing to kill Jews anywhere they find them, and that this is analogous to 1930s Germany. Netanyahu has called for a stronger crackdown against the student protesters in the U.S. He says now, fortunately, state, local, federal officials and others, many of them have responded differently, but there has to be more. More has to be done, he said in a video statement on Wednesday. And we, of course, have opposition leaders in Israel, like the former Prime Minister Yair Lapid, issuing similar demands and even calling for the White House's direct intervention. Biden has vocally condemned the anti-Semitic protest and promised that he has, quote, set up a program to deal with that. The president has defamed young Americans leading the demonstrations as reprehensible and dangerous, claiming we've seen harassment and calls for violence against Jews at the protests. However, activists from Jewish groups organizing the campus actions deny such threats are taking place and say there is no danger. So a Jewish student at Columbia named Jared Cannell told the TRT news outlet, quote, I am perfectly safe here, and this has all been a distraction because they don't want us talking about the nonstop massacre of Gaza, of Palestinian civilians being taken out by the IDF, the Israeli apartheid army. And conversely, Jewish Voice for Peace, which helped lead the Gaza Solidarity encampment and organize it, said that the actual attacks against Jewish students are being launched by the university administrators, calling in the police to attack them and to put them down. The JVP put out a statement that said Columbia University has actively created a hostile environment for students who are Palestinian or who support Palestinian freedom. Additionally, the administration's actions have made the campus much less safe for Jewish students. And so this next story is from Middle East Eye about violence taking place at UCLA as we see more tensions rise. And these protests are continuing. So they write here that skirmishes broke out over the weekend between pro-Palestinian protesters and pro-Israel counter-protesters at the University of California, Los Angeles on Sunday as demonstrations over the war continue to flare across American campuses. The tone turned ugly around midday when a group of protesters broke through a barrier that separated the rival crowds and began shoving and shouting, in some cases trading punches. Security guards attempted to keep the two sides separated while campus police stood by and watched. According to videos published on social media, some of the pro-Israel counter-protesters could be heard shouting racial slurs at the pro-Palestine crowd, while others were filmed calling for pro-Palestinian female supporters to be raped. Of course, there's that notorious video of Medea Benjamin of Code Pink holding up a sign, Jews for a ceasefire. I believe it was in Washington, D.C., where a group of Zionists walked up to her, women actually, and said, basically just with this like outpouring of rape fantasies about how they can't wait to see Medea get raped by Hamas and so they can film it and then dismember her and mutilate her. And it's just very psychotic, quite frankly. And we've seen some other clips of some of these pro-Israel counter-protesters walking up to the Palestinian activists and calling them the N-word and threatening them with violence. And more of this is coming out just across social media throughout the day so far, including with a lot of, again, threats of violence against people at UCLA. And so the demonstrations, they say, involved at least some people from outside the university, which issued a statement on Sunday saying that they had allowed the two groups on campus to express their views. The vice chancellor of UCLA Strategic Communications put out a statement saying this morning a group of demonstrators breached a barrier that the university had established, separating the two groups of protesters on our campus, resulting in physical altercations. UCLA has a long history of being a place of peaceful protest, and we are heartbroken about the violence that broke out. We have since instituted additional security measures and increased the numbers of our safety team members on site. In the past 2 weeks, pro-Palestinian protests have spread to college campuses across the U.S. following the previously mentioned mass arrest of about 100 people at Columbia University, when the school's president asked New York police to enter the campus to dismantle the encampment of tents set up by the protesters on the main lawn. Since then, hundreds of protesters from California and Texas to Atlanta and Boston have been arrested as they emulated the encampments used by the Columbia students to call attention to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Administrators, including those of Columbia, have said the protests are unauthorized, they break school rules, disrupt learning, and have fostered harassment and anti-Semitism. Students opposed to Israel's war in Gaza are demanding their respective schools divest their investments from Israel or from companies profiting off of the war in Gaza and Israel's wider abuses against Palestinians. Another one of the demands is for the schools to cut ties with Israeli academic institutions, which they say have played a key role in Israel's occupation of Palestine. Fitzer College in California recently shut down their study abroad program with the University of Haifa after concluding that the partnership did not align with the college's core values. Over the course of the weekend, more than 200 people were arrested at a handful of schools, including Washington University and St. Louis. Among those arrested at Washington University was 2024 Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. And Stein said in a statement that they're sending in the riot police and basically creating a riot in an otherwise peaceful demonstration. So this is just shameful. Since the events of October 7th, when a Hamas-led attack on southern Israel killed about 1,150 and resulted in more than 200 people being taken to Gaza as hostages, the Strip has been under total siege and deprived of basic necessities while facing a devastating bombing campaign by Israel. More than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed and about 1.7 million have been displaced in what has been ruled as a plausible genocide by the World Court. So, it's very encouraging to see these anti-war protests proliferating throughout the country. It's one of the best developments we've seen in terms of anti-war activism in many years. I think it might even be bigger than the protests during the Iraq War. And we'll have to see how long it can be sustained. But of course, we're seeing tons of propaganda coming out where they're just blanketly calling these people anti-Semites, even though so many of them are Jewish. And we've seen really horrific violence and violent scenes of cops, even including on horseback at, say, Emory University or the University of Texas in Austin, where it's just, they're just beating people up, arresting, I saw a video of one of these universities where a woman who was the head of the philosophy department was just put in handcuffs and arrested. And there's another video where a woman's one of her students is being brutalized and zip tied and bound and beaten. And she leans over and says to him, "Are you okay?" And this big cop jumps up and says to her, "Get down on the ground, get down on the ground," and throws her on the ground and starts kneeing her in the back. And she's in basically disbelief because, for a lot of people, I think it must be pretty stunning given that, these are some of the college campuses, and particularly some of these universities are some of the wokest institutions in the United States. To have the heads of these universities calling in cops to come in and just completely brutalize and crush these people must be pretty shocking. And so, of course, but the fact is, I mean, the people seem to not be relenting. And of course, if there's not a change in the policy or of the university, let alone the administration, I think we're going to see a continuation of that. But Dave DeCamp has this new story out at antiwar.com today about how Richie Torres and Mike Lawler, who are two very pro-Israel representatives, one's a Democrat. Richie Torres is the Democrat. I believe he represents the Bronx. And Mike Lawler is a Republican from New York. The name of the article is "Bipartisan Bill Would Create Anti-Semitism Monitors at College Campuses," and it sounds like, again, we're going to see more and more pressure applied to these universities. So Dave writes, a bill introduced in the House by Representative Richie Torres and Mike Lawler would create anti-Semitism monitors at colleges funded by the U.S. federal government, a reaction to widespread pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have falsely been labeled anti-Semitic. The protests against the U.S.-backed Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza have led some members of Congress, including House Speaker Mike Johnson, to call for President Biden to send in the National Guard. And we're only about 4 or 5 days away from the anniversary of the Kent State murders during the Vietnam War, where the National Guard opened fire and shot more than 4, but killed 4 college protesters. And so the prime minister of course, Israel has already called for similar measures. The bill from Torres and Lawler takes a different approach to combat the protests. According to a press release from Torres and Lawler, the legislation known as the Columbia Act, the College Oversight and Legal Updates Mandating Bias Investigations and Accountability Act, would, quote, empower the Federal Department of Education to impose a third-party anti-Semitism monitor on any college or university receiving federal funding. The monitor would be appointed by the Secretary of Education. The terms and conditions of the monitorship would be set up by the Secretary, and the expenses of the monitorship would be paid by the particular college or university that has been selected for monitorship. Failure to comply with the monitorship would result in the loss of federal funds. The demonstrations are being labeled by Israeli supporters in the U.S. despite as anti-Semitic by the pro-Israel people in the U.S. despite the fact that so many Jewish students are participating in the demonstrations, including in the encampment at Columbia. Many of the protests across the country are demanding their universities divest from Israel or companies profiting from Israel's genocidal war. So, of course, I presume that they're going to lean on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, which the State Department also has signed on to, which is basically labeling any criticism of Israel, including pointing out that it's an apartheid state, as intrinsically anti-Semitic. And so, this is I'm sure there's going to be a lot of support for this bill. And we're just going to see more pressure applied on the universities to crack down. When really, I mean, of course, these are supposed to be institutions of free expression, and you're supposed to have a great exchange of ideas, and all sides are supposed to be heard from. But of course, that's just what ostensibly these institutions are, and of course, they're highly politicized, and I'm sure, as we can already see, that the administrators are going to lack the spine necessary to stand up to the pro-Israel political establishment here in the U.S., and are probably going to institute some of these measures. And of course, they don't want to lose their federal funding. But again, just very disappointing. And unfortunately, we're going to see more and more attacks on the First Amendment as this war continues. And more, and not just the TikTok ban, but other measures like this. And so, of course, it's in the interests of both, anybody on the political spectrum, even if you are pro-Israel, to not support these policies targeting these college students, because, of course, it's going to affect everybody else when you're the ones protesting. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of hypocrisy from people, particularly on the right, who, of course, have a legitimate beef when it comes to how, the January 6th protesters were treated versus the BLM rioters from 2020. But now we see a great many conservative media talking heads promoting the actions of the cops and praising them and egging them on to crack down even harder on these anti-war protesters. So that's very disappointing. But again, hopefully we see some steadfastness here from the protesters. Okay, so now we're moving on to Blinken is in Riyadh. Ostensibly our top diplomat is focused once again on Israeli-Saudi normalization and exhorts Hamas to accept a ceasefire. So Blinken claims, and again, it's Tony Blinken, so I don't really see any reason to believe him. And this sounds so absurd, but he says a deal to normalize relations between Tel Aviv and Riyadh is near completion. He claimed this during his visit to the kingdom on April 29th, which is Monday of this week, adding that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have done intensive work together over the last month to move the issue forward. He says the work that Saudi Arabia, the United States have been doing together in terms of our own agreements, I think is potentially very close to completion. He said this in Riyadh during a panel discussion of the World Economic Forum. And so Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is reportedly asking for a deal that includes Washington giving Riyadh agreements on bilateral defense and security commitments, as well as selling Riyadh advanced weapons and providing its civilian nuclear technology. In return for normalization, the Saudi leader is also reportedly asking Israel to agree to a pathway for Palestinian statehood, something the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly rejected and devoted his career to preventing. It's going to be politically impossible, even if Netanyahu was willing to do it to make this deal go through. I don't think it's going to be tenable for him to do that. And so far, there's absolutely no indication that he would make that concession, even if it was just a rhetorical throwaway line about how we're ultimately looking for a two-state solution, but we can't right now. We still have to deal with Hamas, and he could come up with something, but they're not going to do that. And Blinken's visit comes as negotiations have intensified. It comes as negotiations are intensifying for a possible ceasefire and prisoner exchange deal between Israel and Hamas. Israel has threatened for months to invade Rafah, where 1.3 million displaced Palestinians are sheltering to escape Israeli bombing elsewhere in the besieged enclave. On Friday, Israel reportedly warned Hamas that this was their last chance for a ceasefire deal before Israel launches its long-planned assault. In Riyadh on Monday, Blinken said he has not yet seen a plan from Israel on a Rafah offensive that would protect civilians. He says, we have not yet seen a plan that gives us confidence that civilians can be effectively protected, reiterating that is still the case. We've heard U.S. officials make that statement repeatedly, including John Kirby, that the Israelis, and there's been weeks and weeks of talks between top officials about this, and yet they still have not been given any sort of a plan as to how they're going to deal with the civilians in Rafah if they do go through with the invasion, which they've been hyping for months and months. And though Israel has not launched a ground invasion of Rafah yet, its Air Force continues to bomb the city. Israeli bombing killed at least 22 people, including 6 women and 5 children on Monday. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan met with Blinken on Monday and stressed the importance of reaching an immediate ceasefire and ensuring the entry of aid into Gaza, according to a statement from the Saudi Foreign Ministry on the social media platform X. Blinken will also visit Jordan and Israel after his visit to Saudi Arabia. This comes as his visit to the region comes as a Hamas delegation was due to arrive in Egypt for further ceasefire talks today. Again, that's Monday of this week. Though Israel has killed over 34,000 people in Gaza and completely devastated the tiny strip through 6 months of nonstop bombing of urban civilian areas, Blinken said on Monday that Hamas has an extraordinarily generous proposal before it from Israel. Hamas has before it a proposal that is extraordinarily generous on the part of Israel. They have to decide, and they have to decide quickly, Blinken said. I'm hopeful they will make the right decision. And this is just unbelievable. Once again, this is rather fanciful. I don't think the Saudis are going to go ahead and make this deal. There was a great write-up in Middle East Eye after the retaliatory attack on Israel that Iran had launched with ballistic and cruise missiles and drones. against some military sites in Israel after the Israelis bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus on April 1st. And the sources in the report discussed how the Saudis and other Arab states in the region that host U.S. forces scrutinized their basing agreements in order to make sure that the Americans would not launch any retaliatory strikes against Iran from their territory. And there's all kinds of discussion in that report about how the Saudis are actually quite pleased with the relative détente they've reached with Iran since the Chinese mediated a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia back in March of last year. And any sort of closer alignment with Israel, let alone the United States, with these security agreements, which they were they were trying to achieve before October 7th, I think would just be very unlikely at this point. Most of the world and certainly most of the region, based on the ICJ decision, as well as numerous polls that have been conducted, show that most people view this war on Gaza as a war of genocide. And of course, when you're killing tens of thousands, potentially more, we really don't know the number of civilians who are trapped under rubble from all the hundreds of thousands of buildings that have been bombed, how many people have been killed. But the fact that that they would make a normalization deal, basically giving their seal of approval to the Israeli apartheid state, and basically doing like an Abraham's Accord style agreement, but for more benefits than the other states that the UAE, like let's say the UAE or Bahrain, received. I still don't see that as a real possibility, but I understand why Blinken would say this, because of course the Biden administration needs some sort of diplomatic win, some sort of foreign policy achievement that they can run on. And of course, this is not being done in service of stability for the region or to protect U.S. troops in the region who are now already getting attacked again in Iraq and Syria as a result of these policies of the Biden administration. So it has nothing to do with safety or security for the region or the American people. They're just trying to do they're just doing basically they're working on behalf of the Israelis once again. And so this just seems unlikely, but we'll stay on top of it and see if there's any further developments. I will say this, that I was myself pretty surprised. I forget exactly how soon before. It might have been in September of last year. But MBS did an interview with Brett Baer on Fox News where he did say himself that a deal was, he said, we haven't gotten there yet, but we get closer and closer every day to a normalization deal with Israel. But that was then. At this point, I find it very unlikely that the Saudis would make this deal with Israel. It would just be a complete political disaster. So we'll stay on top of that. This next story, this is getting more into this question of what kind of plan the Israelis have to quote, supposedly protect civilians, or what kind of evacuation plan they have for Rafah in the event of this invasion that is, that is apparently, well, it looks more and more like it's going to happen, even though there's been a slight softening in rhetoric. So this is from Middle East Eye. They have this new report, Israel planning a ring of checkpoints to prevent men from fleeing Rafah. Israel is setting up a complex system of checkpoints that will prevent men of, quote, military age from fleeing Rafah in preparation for its offensive on the southern Gaza border city. A senior Western official familiar with Israel's plans has told Middle East Eye on the condition of anonymity. The checkpoints are designed to allow some women and children to leave Rafah ahead of an expected Israeli offensive, but unarmed civilian Palestinian men will likely be separated from their families and remain trapped in Rafah during an expected Israeli assault. The previously unreported disclosure of Israel's construction of a ring of checkpoints around Rafah underscores how Israel is pushing ahead with plans to attack the city, where over 1 million displaced Palestinians are sheltering in tents and makeshift camps. Base checkpoints around light back on Israel's practice of stripping and forcibly detaining male Palestinian men and children as it faces rising scrutiny in the West of its conduct in the war. The rounding up of Palestinian males in Gaza and photographing them stripped to their underwear drew condemnation in December, while the U.S. With the U.S. calling the images deeply disturbing. Relatives of many of the men photographed recognized them and said they had nothing to do with Hamas. Israel's military was later accused of staging footage of men surrounding weapons. Israel considers every male a Hamas fighter until proven otherwise. But that's a quote from Abbas Dahouk, a former senior military advisor to the State Department and military attaché in the Middle East, speaking to Middle East Eye. He says it's not a sound move. Coordinating Rafah is a daunting task, and good luck separating fathers and sons from their families. Israel's preparations for an assault are occurring at the same time that it continues down-the-wire truce talks with Hamas. A delegation from Hamas is set to visit Egypt on Monday for further negotiations. The U.S., the UN, European states, and Arab powers are pushing to avert a Rafah offensive, which aid workers and diplomats say could spark a humanitarian disaster and potential refugee crisis. Blinken on Monday urged Hamas to accept the latest offer, which again he called extremely generous. In this moment, the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and a ceasefire is Hamas, Blinken said in Riyadh at the World Economic Forum. They have to decide, and they have to decide quickly. In Riyadh, Blinken met with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and the Qatari Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. Both Qatar and Turkey maintain ties with Hamas, with the former hosting the group's political leadership at the request of Washington. Egypt, which borders Rafah and whose security establishment talks directly with Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades, is also mediating. Middle East Eye had reached out to the White House and the Israeli embassy in Washington for comments on this story, but neither have responded by the time of publication. Israel has offered a 40-day truce to Hamas and the return of thousands of Palestinians held in Israeli jails in exchange for hostages. It has also downsized its demand that at least 40 hostages held in Gaza be released, with the new figure being placed at 33 hostages. But Hamas has called for a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, and the return of forcibly displaced Palestinians to return to their homes. A key sticking point in the talks has been Hamas's demand that Palestinian families are not to be separated going back to their homes. And of course, there have been horrible reports of Palestinians in Gaza being shot by the IDF who are attempting to reach their homes or what possibly can remain of them in the north. And so it's unlikely that those demands would be met. As truce talks drag on, Israel has ramped up its threat to invade Rafah, where it says 4 Hamas battalions are stationed. As the threat of an Israeli attack mounts, Hamas has also released more hostage videos. Israel's potential assault on Rafah is in many ways unique to warfare. The border town turned sprawling refugee camp is hemmed in on the left by the Mediterranean Sea and on the right by Israel proper, both of which Israel controls. Egyptian troops are still massed along Gaza's southern border, where Cairo has vowed to prevent an influx of refugees. Hamas fighters have shed their uniforms and disappeared into a vast tunnel network, military experts say. Israeli analysts have told Middle East Eye previously that the Israeli war cabinet believes it can't declare victory in Gaza without attacking Rafah, but other analysts say the bloody assault is unlikely to extract Israel from the Gaza quagmire. The conduct of Israel's operations from the north to the south has been revenge-driven, not intelligence-driven, Dahouk told Middle East Eye. They don't know where the enemy is. It's reconnaissance by fire. And of course, this dovetails with reports we've seen on Israeli intelligence estimates and U.S. intelligence estimates that they're not putting a dent really in Hamas in their ability to continue waging an insurgency and guerrilla warfare against the Israelis, and that they'll be dealing with this for years and years, even at the current rate of devastation. And of course, it seems that we're going to. There hasn't been any pressure put on the Netanyahu regime. In fact, before the Iranians attacked Israel in response to the bombing of their consulate in Syria, CNN had reported that the day of that attack, the day after, it was on Monday, I think, they were going to drop leaflets and let the population there know that we're coming in. And so they delayed that in response to the attack from Iran, and to see what their next steps would be. But that just demonstrates again that the White House is completely full of it when it comes to the remarks they've made about any sort of pressure they're applying to Netanyahu. And there really is not much of a debate within the security cabinet. I actually just saw a report about how Benny Gantz is threatening to basically topple the Israeli government if a deal is made with Hamas for a prisoner exchange. He's saying we should have a prisoner exchange and we need to get the hostages back. But if there's anything in there to do with a permanent ceasefire or an end of the war, he will work to topple the Israeli government. That it's not fit to exist. And this is, there's a lot of pro-Israel supporters who would like to throw Netanyahu under the bus in order to maintain the status quo, and they think Benny Gantz would be like a good replacement for Netanyahu. But that just goes to show once again that the support for the war and that's the particular way it's being conducted is pretty unanimous. Now we have seen some quotes from, say, the Israeli foreign minister, who said recently that they would suspend the operation if a deal was made for an exchange of hostages and prisoners. But that doesn't mean that it would be called off. It's left rather ambiguous. And so we have to see. And I think it's possible that they're going to make an offer to, the most likely thing would be that the offer to Hamas is going to be pretty consistent with what the Israelis have been doing so far, and namely that they wouldn't agree to a ceasefire. They wouldn't agree to lifting the siege and allowing aid in unimpeded, and certainly not allowing the displaced Palestinians to return to their homes. So there probably won't be a deal that can be made, and then the Israelis can say that, well, we offered them, we Blinken said we gave them this extraordinarily generous offer, and then they'll just go in and slaughter the Palestinians in Gaza, in Rafah. We've already seen reports from, a group of experts who are suggesting that by August, with the way the war is being conducted at this rate, we're going to see more than 100,000 casualties, and potentially more than that, I believe 120,000, if there is an attack on Rafah, if it goes through the way they've planned it. And so it's just devastating, but we're going to have to see what happens. Of course, it looks like it's just going to be an absolute catastrophe. And we have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians already on the brink of starvation. And that Rafah crossing is really the last entry point for what little aid is being allowed in. And we're only talking about tens of trucks. Before the war, they were getting 500 trucks of aid in a day under the full blockade that's been on Gaza for about 17 years. And now, barely anything is getting in. And certainly they need much more in order to help these people. I mean, we're probably going to see tens of thousands die as a result of this starvation, this war of starvation anyway. But the worst of it could probably be mediated if there was a lifting of the siege right now and allowing aid to come in unimpeded. But that's very unlikely, and it looks like they're just going to go ahead with the invasion of Rafah.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the update, everybody. That'll wrap up the show for today. We'll be back with more later in the week.